am in the information systems area, so always trying to play around with tech and trying to figure out how students can leverage, of course, we're talking about AI here, but AI in a way that actually gives them some kind of cognitive challenges rather than use that as a Q&A machine, which, is widely known to pretty much be cognitive offloading or, I solve my assignments or my projects. So that's been my effort over the last, I guess, pretty much since ChatGPT launched. So that's now 3 years plus, and trying to sort of build solutions and then getting students to build to learn, right? So that's the couplet I'm going with: build to learn and learn to build. And I'll share, um, my and I'm writing up some thoughts on that. I'll share that for you to read later. But I wanted to take, I guess, I think the three of us decided we'll do 10 to 15 minutes each and then open it up for questions. Now, Jeff, does that sound right?
Yeah, it sounds fine to me.
Okay. Um, so I wanted to share some of the projects that I built for class, for outside of class use as well, and sort of motivate you that for a person, I mean, I'm obviously not in CS, Jeff is, but over the last year, with the ability of these tools to essentially amplify or augment, again, we talk about automate, augment, and innovate, right? So, of course, cost savings, automation, augment, more productivity, innovation is where you can start doing stuff in a new way or doing new stuff that was not possible earlier, either individually or in a team. So uh, assuming, which most of us are, right, we are, I don't claim to be an expert in anything, but we have some kind of depth in some domain. And if you learn to use these tools, and in this case, sort of, and this works for students, faculty, staff as well. This is not just a student facing perspective, which is built to learn, right? So you build with these tools and you learn. So I'll give you a glimpse of some of the projects that I've built and used in the classroom as an inspiration for you to explore building with these tools. And for those of you who in the are in the summer program, I demonstrated the Canvas MCP yesterday, right? So that it's following in that same vein. So let me share my screen, and I will also share. So I don't have a presentation, but I'll walk you through some of the projects and learnings, and in the next 5 odd minutes, and then hand it over to Jeff. I need approval to share my screen. Sent the request to you, Jim.
Second. Now a co-host.
Yep. Okay. Should work. So this is one of the places where I highlight some of the projects, and since we're all on Zoom, I can share this link in the chat as well, and you can, and this is 10 out of the 80 projects that I've done over the last year, and some of these are student co-created with students, because that's what this platform is highlighting. So let's look at something that just developed over the last week, UniQuick. You can take a look at it, but not immediately relevant for students to use in the classroom, but this is more for faculty. And this is a prototype. So I'll talk about this one first. So some of you might have heard about the craze around these sort of anything with a suffix of the word claw, which is basically agentic systems that run on a resource, whether on your computer or on a server, which is essentially like a personal assistant, right? So that's where the open clause and the nano clause and all of that crazy hype like over the last 6 months, and has quite frankly changed how even enterprises think about what these things can do. So I leverage that same infrastructure to say that can we meet students where they are more likely to listen? Because I know Canvas emails nobody reads. I ask every time in the class, right? I send an email, say, hey, how many of you actually read that email? Yeah, 15%. Because Canvas doesn't let me do that tracking anyway. So this was an attempt to provide an assistant, which was not just a chatbot, but it was sort of a drip learning campaign that I could run uh, from my end, which would feed information to the students, sort of like spaced repetition, right? So drip learning is marketing jargon. Spaced repetition is education terminology. Um, and this was working through WhatsApp using my own WhatsApp number. So right now, I was a bot talking to 36 or whatever, 38 students. And predictably, the highest traffic was around tests and submissions and stuff, right? Where students were asking questions, but otherwise, I was feeding them information through the week as well, right? So I would do a session on Tuesday, then follow up on Wednesday, Thursday with some tidbits about that lesson, some follow up, some questions related to that session. And then, of course, when there was a test or something, the activity would spike with students pulling information. And as part of the training, not training, context for this bot, I had put in sample questions that I would give. So there was some incentive for students to, explore using this bot over time. So that was one. Uh, so this was again sort of a multi-agent geese claw. I mean, I just picked these names, right? So don't go too much into the names. So this is an interesting mental model, right? So I'll let you read that for a second. I don't even know. I know if anybody's in the physical room, the screen is not good for reading. But this was an idea to say that can we have agents provide different perspectives, right? So they take a persona, they challenge perspectives, and each of these were kind of like a statement with a thesis, and then a hypothesis, and then linked research, and then a student would respond, and then the bot would respond back, and the bot had a certain position to take. So, different areas, entrepreneurship, all of this was seeded by me to simulate this exercise. This never got used, right? So, this is just kind of like, here's possible. I did something else around ethics, multi-agent debate. Again, this is all ideas based on somebody did something somewhere. I looked at that idea and I built it right in a day or two. And some of these take longer to get to usable state. This is led by a student, multimodal. So students, a collection of students coming together, brainstorming on a particular problem, and the AI backend is actually making connections between topics. And then you can interact voice, you can write text, and it is actually making a network graph of the concepts. And in this case, we used it in my class again, data modeling, and it did a reasonable job of integrating the views of a group of students. So we had teams and rooms into a data model. We probably need some more work on it, but getting there. Now, Mind Forum again in production. I use this uh, for students to again talk to simulated personas, but in a multiplayer room. So it was no longer one student, one bot. It was many students talking to each other, talking to the bot, getting summaries from the bot, and some other dynamic interactions. So this was a multiplayer uh, room. And all of these are gated by their Illinois IDs. So, it's secure to get in. This is unrelated program. We had done a AI event. This is again related to my class, built by a student. This is a program level thing. So these are some of the options. I will stop there. I'm at about 214, 215. But the idea being, I'm not a professional coder. And yesterday I told people to download one of these tools like Codex or Cloud Desktop or Cloud Code, and just get started. Actually, I wanted to show one more, which probably people can try as well. And I mean, yeah, I position this for business students. Let me just show one more one. And this is a nice mental model that you all can try if you decide. Where's my share button? Here. Okay, so Codex is one of the tools that, so those of you who are on ChatGPT, Codex is ChatGPT's the other half for doing, agentic stuff, knowledge work. Don't go by the word code anymore. Cloud Code is not for code only. Codex is not for code only. And very soon this will merge with ChatGPT, so you won't even have to worry about the word code anymore. Anyway, this was around an idea of, okay, students need to learn to use tools beyond these chat on a browser. Codex was getting pretty good, and 99% of students know ChatGPT. So I said, let's build a course inside Codex so that students learn Codex, but make it domain specific. So in this case, I was doing an entrepreneurship activity. I said, okay, so use Codex to learn Codex, and while doing that, you'll set up a small business. That was the idea, because the agent, while inside a tool, can guide the interaction. So all of you can also download Codex, point it at this website, and experience an agent coaching you how to build a business while giving you enough preview of the features of the tool itself. So you can copy this, it's on GitHub, and change it to your domain, whatever you want. This is a good mental model to see when you want students to build literacy in the tool itself, but tailored to your domain. I'll stop there. So I guess we can do questions at the end. So I guess over to Jeff or Jena.
Jena, do you want to go next?
Yeah, I'm happy to. Let me make sure I can share. Sometimes. All right. Can we all see this? Summer AI Studio?
Yep.
Good. Okay, awesome. Thank you. Okay, so have loved being part of this and being able to see what everyone's working on. My name's Jena Marble. I'm a clinical associate professor now of graphic design in the School of Art and Design and College of Fine and Applied Arts. And no surprise, many of our students and many of our students' parents are concerned about AI and the future of their jobs and perspectives. And I'd actually say I'm with my students, I don't necessarily go in and say, like AI good, AI bad. I've said this a few times already throughout the week that my position is that as a clinical professor, I have industry background. It's my job to prepare you for professional practice. And part of that is knowing how to use these tools, and whether or not you choose to use them in your practice going forward is up to you. So with all that being said, I want to show a few examples of how we've used AI in my graphic design classrooms. And I also kind of want to talk about maybe something we haven't touched as much on yet, but has been really important in my own classroom, is the idea of fundamentals. And with graphic design, we have a pretty clear progression of courses and learning outcomes. And we've been pretty relentless in the School of Art and Design about teaching fundamentals first without the use of AI, because we think that makes the student outcome stronger once they do start experimenting with these tools. So that's kind of what I want to walk through somewhat quickly today. So I'm going to show a few examples. I teach a lot of typography classes in the School of Art and Design. We have three. I've taught all three. So I want to show you first some of the outcomes from our Type 1 class, because that shows you that we're building strong foundational skills without AI. And if many of you are probably not design professors. But I do think this is relevant because the idea of teaching fundamentals and having that strong foundation before you do more advanced work, I think is pretty applicable to many disciplines. So first, we build strong foundations without AI. That includes tight fundamentals, proficiency in software, where for us it's Adobe. We're also talking about conceptualization and iterative processes. These are all things that are really important to us as designers. And then you'll see how we address introducing AI in future classes. Okay, so for this first case study, it was 18 first and second year students. It was 16 weeks. There were no generative AI tools used, and this was a type class. So their project was to create a custom city-inspired display type. I won't go into like the specifics of type anatomy, but we certainly do in that class. We learn about bowls, counters, xi descenders, all those things that us designers have to know about type. We understand spacing principles. We understand layout fundamentals, things that if AI did for us, we wouldn't be able to recognize if it was proper or not. So we have to manually learn these things the good old way, just by doing it. So for this, I'm going to show you a couple students' work. For this one, in the process we went through, research is also really important in our classes. So for this class and for this project, each student had to pick a city, and then their custom type would be inspired by that city. So this student chose Versailles, and you can see that one of the first things we do is research. I have a number of questions these students have to answer. We look in archives. This student actually went to Versailles, so she was able to reference a lot of her own photography. We go to the library. That's something else I do in my classes, is we're always getting out, looking at things, holding things. That's really important in my classroom too. So after we did that, we started sketching. Sketching is also really important to us as designers. And just something to note too, that I think it's helpful for all of us as we are working with generative AI, if you kind of think about your own work and your own process, and maybe instead of going straight to AI, you are doing things like this. You're researching, you're sketching, you're thinking about many things before you start working with AI. And this is kind of the process we did too. And I think that makes for stronger outcomes. And that's also, less work that you have to do, less back and forth. So I think that's helpful to kind of follow this. It could be applicable to many situations. But this is her sketches. She was really inspired by the ornamentation and like the frames. There's a lot of frames that she saw in Versailles. So she drew a lot from that inspiration. Then from that, we went into Illustrator. This was all, hand drawn with pins, and this is a vector. And then we had to, build a poster from it. So we're getting that composition, that layout practice. So that was one student. And then what I want to show you now is that the same student was in one of my advanced classes. And this is when we introduced generative AI. So this again was 18. Now we have third and fourth year students. This was only an 8-week class, so we kind of fit a lot into a small amount of time. But this was actually creating identity systems for mythical cities. Something else I've noticed about generative AI is that it's really good at helping us imagine things that might be hard to imagine. It's good at world building, speculative work. So each student got assigned a mythical city, Atlantis or El Dorado or Troy. These are places that don't have real reference imagery. So generative AI was really helpful to help us imagine, okay, what would Troy look like based on pop culture or based on archival references? And then the students had to create custom word marks, flags, and then landing pages. So you see this student, it was the same process, no matter if we're using AI or not. We're researching, we are doing a ton of work before we even start designing. So students were able to use either ChatGPT or Gemini. I believe Claude was an option, but this was, 3-ish years ago, I believe. So ChatGPT was really popular at the moment. But you could see there are some questions I asked. Tell me about the city. Each student actually watched a documentary on their city too, and that was helpful. And then this is when we used Adobe Firefly when we're using text image generators, because as university students, they get access to Adobe Creative Cloud programs for a steeply discounted rate. If we want to talk about the ethics of authorship and which tools are maybe a little more ethically minded, we can. I think Adobe is probably one of those. So that's another reason we do use Firefly. But you can see based on the research that this student did, the prompt was create a map, ancient mythical city of Troy, historical looking. She learned a lot about these large walls that were really important to Troy. So you can see the image isn't great. When you look out at first, it looks okay, but then you get in a little closer and you see things don't really make sense, but it's a starting point. And then after that, this is where the student has the inspiration. They did the research, and now this is all in the student's hands. So this was all student made. This was no generative AI was used in the making of this. So you see we have Troy, and then kind of incorporated these columns here where legends rise again. And then they had to make a flag, which is also a very fruitful exercise in symbology and abstract ideas and how to represent something meaningful with just colors and no text. So the work that they did in their type 1 class was really helpful here. And then after that, you could see that they put all of this into a landing page. So this student actually imagined that Troy was discovered, and some of the artwork they took from Troy, you could go visit it in a museum. So this is the work that student did all here. But you could see how I think that foundational work we did in type 1 was really helpful when they got to advanced classes. I just want to show you a few other outcomes before we go over to Jeff. I've used AI in a few of my courses now, none of the foundational ones, but in more of the advanced ones. So this was actually a type 2 class. So in type 1, they learn about typography fundamentals. In type 2, now we're building brand systems. So you could see here that this student actually was inspired by family and tradition and heritage. So she came up with the idea for an Italian restaurant kind of based on her family's Italian recipes passed down generation to generation. And all of this was done by the student. But the only part we used AI was, again, imagining things that were a little bit harder to imagine. So we knew what the space looked like, but because we imagined it, right? We talked about it. We said, this is the personality, this is the vibe of the hotel or the restaurant. And then AI was helpful in helping us bring that to life. So you could see here, like the logo, the color, the type, all of these other systems that was done by the student. And then that really provided the springboard to help create images that were really aligned with the brand. You could see here, those were all done in Firefly. I've got maybe 2 other quick examples just so you can see how we've been using AI in really interesting ways. But one of the things too you'll notice is that a lot of this is still student-led, right? Like AI doesn't necessarily make us quicker. It actually kind of prolongs our process a little bit. I think it makes us it gives us more surprising or more novel outcomes, but really the majority of it is still up to the student to take it and run with it. So this was another class that it was a little bit weirder. It was that 8-week class. And for this one, we thought, what if we could actually use AI to have conversations with artists or movements from the past? So for this class, we imagined, well, what if the Bauhaus had AI? And so we did a lot of research into Bauhaus and principles and outcomes and artists and designers and a lot of things that came out of Bauhaus. And we thought, okay, well, what would that look like if we were interacting with Bauhaus principles using AI tools? And so this student was the one that actually did that previous work with the restaurant. And you could see here that this student was imagining a kind of a home of the future, but very much based on some of the principles and the textiles specifically, and some of the architecture that came out of Bauhaus to kind of imagine what would furniture or lighting look like if we kind of had this space theme. And then those are the sketches. And then here are some of the outcomes. Again, this was all with Firefly, imagining if these were going to be on display in an exhibit, which they actually were in the art and design building. And then each student had to create a poster. And what was also really fruitful about this exercise was having all the students make their own posters inspired by their experiences in the classroom, their learning outcomes. And then we did a prompt or an exercise where we gave Gemini for this class the same exact prompt: create an 18 by 24 poster for if Bauhaus had AI exhibit. Truly, every single poster looked just about identical. There was very, very little difference in how they looked. When the students prompted a little bit further, they got a little farther away from their initial outputs, but it was just a really good reminder too about AI is just trained on data, right? It's predicting the likely output, and if that's all it has to work from, then as humans we have the ability to be creative and pull from different references and ideas. And so that was just a really cool, I think, way to kind of show that the difference between AI generated work and human work in really clear and distinct ways. So one more example too, this was also kind of another weird one. This was my type 3 class. And in that class, we thought, okay, what if we had some scientific data? Because as a R1 research institution, there's a lot of really important research coming out of our university. But a lot of it can be really dense. It's not so easy to understand to lay people if you're not familiar with the data or what's being discussed. It's important, but it might not be super, impactful. And so for this class, we actually worked with Dr. Eunice from the physics department, and he actually does a lot with the art and design school. He co-taught a class with our studio chair, Patrick Hammy, in the spring. But he came into our class and helped us imagine, what would it be like if designers worked interdisciplinarily with researchers, with scientists. And it was actually a really great course. Designers are needed everywhere, and in science fields, it's no different. So we did a lot of field trips. We went to the archives, we went to the libraries. This was also an exhibit in the School of Art and Design building. And I did a very long talk on this with Bethany Anderson from the library. There is a webinar, it's a Library Friends. If anyone's interested in that, I can just share the link if you want to learn more about this class, because it was really interesting. It's just kind of hard to distill down in maybe 30 seconds. But we did a lot of work with AI here because we were working with really complex ideas. I don't understand hypervelocity stars, but when we were able to kind of talk back and forth with AI, it helped us understand it a little bit. So then we could turn those into visual narratives and really interesting ways to tell stories. So this was also a really nice outcome. But again, we go really in depth into what the course was about during that Library Friends webinar. So I can share a link if you're interested. Okay, maybe the last 2 minutes before we turn it over to Jeff. Just some things I took away and what I've taken away and continue to implement in my classroom as AI becomes more and more prominent is that, again, students with strong foundations, I found that they use AI more strategically, especially for ideation and exploration. They're not going to it first. We're doing sketching, we're doing prototyping outside of our computers even before we go to AI to maybe think things through or get new ideas. The students that have that foundation, they maintained creative control and decision-making a little bit better. Instead of kind of, deferring to AI, they were really in control of it. And then I also think that they demonstrate really sophisticated design thinking. Some of the outcomes from those students that have strong foundations, some of the work they're doing with AI is really, really creative and impactful. And then without those foundations, we risk students becoming overly dependent on AI, lacking the skills to evaluate outputs. So that example with the Bauhaus posters, I knew that the posters looked awful and there was nothing interesting or even, I wouldn't even say novel about them. They were very expected, but if you don't have that foundation and that experience, you might not know that. And then it also misses opportunities for really meaningful human creativity. I remain optimistic about the future of creativity and designers more broadly. But if we don't use AI thoughtfully and responsibly, then we miss opportunities to, I think, really use it in those meaningful ways. And then this is something, just the last thing I'll say is in my class, we're continuing to do the sequencing foundations before we use AI, thinking about how we assess work too. Documenting process is really important in my class. I have Miro boards for every student. They're showing me what they're doing. We have 3-hour studio courses so I can evaluate what they're doing, not just how proficient they are at using AI, because that's not the goal. We're building critical thinking about AI from day one. Didn't have a ton of time to think about that now, but we are. So if anyone wants to talk more about that, I would love to. And then preserving that iterative hands-on learning experience is so important for our studio courses, and that's something that we continue to do. All right. I think hopefully that's enough time for you, Jeff, but if anyone has questions, happy to answer at the end, or you can email me, of course.
All right, I'm going to get started because I do want us to have time for discussion. So I'll try to get through this quickly. So I've been doing, my name is Jeff Challen. I teach in the Siebel School, taught introductory computing here for about a decade. As I was listening to the other talks, I was originally going to speak about the work I've done setting up a brand new course about AI, where there really is tight AI integration throughout the entire class. And if I have a minute, which I probably won't, I will try to sneak that in at the end. But as I was listening to the other talks, I thought it might be more valuable for this audience to hear a little bit about how we're incorporating AI into our introductory CS course. And so this is something we've been working on over the past year. So, you know, in the past, for long periods of time, we had a model of how we did a computing assignment. And I think this model is generalizable to other areas. So I think that you could probably also fit this into your own context. So, you know, I would come up with an idea for an assignment. I would give the students a specification, typically a written specification, and then the students would turn in a program. There's some type of deliverable at the end. And the problem, and then, you know, you hand back a grade, which is, again, based on that specification. So the specification plays a really core role here, both because it describes to the student what they need to do, but it also describes to the student how their work's going to be evaluated. The problem with AI, so I started using these tools heavily last summer. And one of the things that I did that I would suggest that all faculty do, because I think it's really an eye-opening experience, and you need to do this well, you need to get good tools, is I sat down and I said, okay, I'm going to try to do my large programming assignment using AI. I'm just going to let it do as much as possible. And I sat there and watched for about an hour, and this is a heavily sped up video of that experience as Claude Code, which at the time was a much less powerful tool than it is now, was nonetheless able to complete this entire sort of 8-week-long project that we had students doing in the second half of the course. And so this was a moment for me where I really realized, we have to do something different. Because, and this is, I think, particularly true for coding assignments and computing, but increasingly true in other domains, which is that same specification that we give to the student that has to be precise so that they can turn in completed work is the exact thing that they can then hand to an AI tool, which can then return the artifact. And in many ways, I would also argue, this is what I want my students to do. I don't want them to be reproducing work that can be done much more quickly and much more accurately by any tool, right? Whether that's a compiler or an AI agent. And so we have to sort of rethink this model. And I think that there are, a couple of justifiable ways to think about assignments in this era. One is if you can really make sure that students don't have access to AI, you can give them a more traditional assignment. But in many cases, I don't think that we should assume students don't have access to AI because they are using these tools. And in that world, I think what we need to do is find new assignments that engage students in a collaboration with AI that still allow them to do useful and meaningful work while learning how to collaborate with AI in order to produce something meaningful. And I think in many cases, these assignments can be a ton of fun. And what I'm going to show you, I think, is actually a really positive change to the course that emerged from us just accepting the reality of the abilities that these tools have today. So first, in fall, so in the past, what we had done is we had this, this is one component of the course, by the way. It's not the whole course. We still have a classical programming is what I call it now, a component of the course where we assess students in our testing center on campus. And so that is sort of very secure against AI. But this out of sort of unproctored component, in the past, we had every student build the same app, and we had tests that we used to evaluate their work. And so what we tried in the fall was we had tried essentially giving them what I would refer to as a blurred specification, a specification that we were hoping that they would have to still do some work to implement with their coding agent. We were showing them how to use coding agents. I'm 100% on board with that. I think that in many ways, that's the most valuable thing that I can teach a beginning student in one of my courses. They may never take another computing course. If they don't, knowing how to use a coding agent is the thing that's going to allow them to do the most work in this space and also continue to learn more through interactions and the ability for these tools to tutor our students. So this is what we tried in fall, and it didn't work, right? Students basically told us that they felt like they learned very little, partly because the tools are just too good. That specification that we gave them, because it had to be accurate enough for them to understand what to do, was accurate enough for AI to understand how to do the assignment. So we went back to the drawing board, and me and my staff talked about this a lot. And I started to think, after 6 months of using these tools myself, I had a better understanding of, what is still hard about, working in this space. It used to be, I've written code for 25 years. It used to be that the difficult part, and it was awful and pretty dehumanizing, was writing down the code and getting it to work. And that is no longer difficult. The hard part now is getting your ideas out of your head into a specification that the AI coding agent can use, and then validating that it's done the right thing. So what I wanted is I want the student to come up with the idea, work together with AI to build it, and then turn in something. And so what this led to was, rather than having every student building the same app, which frankly is also pretty boring because the app they're building is pretty boring and has to be very generic. What we allowed them to do last semester was every student in my 400 student class completed their own independent project. We had a series of activities they completed throughout the first half of the semester where they came up with an idea. They talked about it with classmates. They got feedback from my course staff. They started brainstorming with Claude, which is the tool that we had them use for the course. We had students purchase access to Claude Code, which required $60 of outlay on their part, $20 per month, and it was only really over 3 months of the course where they needed it. So we had them do a series of exercises coming up with their ideas, and then in the second half of the course, they built them through collaboration with Claude. I'll skip over this. Essentially, I'll point out one of the interesting things about this that I anticipated happily was that I told my staff, I said, given how effective these tools are, 2 or 3 weeks into this 8-week project, we're going to have students coming to us and saying, I'm done. What do I do now? So we came up with a way to address that. Every student was first assigned to build what we call an MVP in software development. This is a minimum viable product, basically a small working version of the app. Once they completed that, we had a series of other tasks for them to work on. And the goal here was to essentially allow them to continue practicing collaborating with AI throughout the remainder of the semester. How do we grade these? I'm sure many of you are already thinking that. We tried something new here. We said, I don't know how far students are going to get. They've all picked different projects. Why don't we grade them based on effort? So we collected their transcripts of their interactions with the coding agent, and we used a pipeline that itself incorporated some AI to estimate how much time each student had taken. And that's what they were graded on. We essentially told them, you need to do 20 hours over, 6 weeks at the end of the class. every one of those hours or do a point towards the 20% of your grade that this represents. If you're wondering how students like this, they didn't. I think primarily because it forced all of them to do the same amount of work. My impression was like, oh, this is very fair because usually when you give an assignment, some students take longer to complete it than others. But in this case, students seem to react negatively against this. But in my experience in my class, students almost always dislike our good ideas, at least initially. Give them 3 or 4 years and then they burn in. The students, one of the most exciting things about this, again, thinking about these new types of assignments that we can let our students work on in this new era, is that the students did like crazy, wild, really interesting, exciting things. And they did things that mattered to them, not to me. We saw students get very, very excited, very engaged with their work because they were working on things they cared about, because they got to build an app that solved a problem that was meaningful to them. We had a whole category. We did an end of semester awards. We had a whole category of like a dozen different students who built apps to help support elderly people using their phones, right? Which is something really cool. So anyway, they did all sorts of neat things. I'm gonna jump over this. These are a few slides, just sort of allaying fears that we're not still teaching classical programming. We are. I think these two things are really complementary in the sense that I'd actually disagree that we need to teach students, the basics first. I think in many ways, in my experience, what we're seeing is that these are complementary abilities. Like students are able to learn how to collaborate with AI to build things and evaluate them alongside learning some of the more basic skills. And the ability to work with AI opens up new opportunities for them to learn things that we haven't had a chance to teach them in my course before, like how do you create an app that's good, or how do you respond to user feedback, or things like that. All right, so go through this. I'm just going to put a short plug in here at the end. So if people, I think one of the other things I wanted to do today is just give people a sense of what's possible. This last semester, alongside making those changes to my introductory CS course, I also taught a new 11-student pilot of a course about AI. And this was an intentional experiment on my part where I said, I am going to utilize, AI in every phase of the course. So I used it to help design materials. I used it to create the whole course infrastructure, and I used it throughout the operations of the class. So I'll stop here so that we have some time for discussion, but happy to answer questions about this. And I have more materials about this project on my website and on the course website itself.
You feel free to unmute and ask questions if you have any for any panelists.
But Patricia, do you want to ask a question?
Yeah, thank you. This question is for Vishal. Sorry, my camera went off. I noticed that you have like a lot of different objects that you're embedding in your courses and you're using with your students. And I was wondering if you have like a limit for like whatever course you teach. Do you have like an upper limit of the number of AI generated tools that you have the students use? And have you ever gotten yourself in a situation where you're using too many things and the students are saying, whoa, we're getting too distracted by all these different different spaces where we have to go and interact
Yeah,
with AI?
always happens. It's like Jeff was saying, students will not like our ideas at least the first time. So I asked them for forgiveness ahead of time, saying, I know I'm making you do too much, but forgive me because it might actually help you in your careers. But yes, I do try and avoid tool bloat. I guess I avoid platform bloat. I don't avoid tool bloat, right? So I've seen courses, both my kids are at UIUC, they've had one platform which links to 5 others. So my course doesn't do that. Everything is contained in one platform. But yes, tools, or because these days I'm building so many, and in many cases students are building with me, right? So they're building artifacts in the class, and the tools themselves are changing so fast that what I used last semester I can't use now. Sometimes within a semester I start with one tool, and by the time I'm ending, I'm saying, no, there's a much better tool out there. Why don't you try this? Yes, so there is that problem, but we try and uh, manage that as best as we can. Yeah.
I think it really depends. I mean, in the AI course I taught, we were doing, there were a lot of ways in which AI was integrated into that class. I think it depends a lot on how you do that. I mean, if like the course feels really disorganized to students and they're constantly having to click on links which are taking them to different websites and stuff like that, I think that students react negatively to that. I think if you can bring everything into one place, that's easier. But I've also always used my own platforms for my courses and never Canvas for anything. So I'm not normal. Colleen, do you have a question?
I'm just wondering, have there been any accessibility issues you all have encountered, or do you have any advice when it comes to accessibility for students as you're using any of these tools? Is there anything we need to be thinking about?
Yeah, when possible, particularly if you need AI backend, I provision it myself, because particularly if these are 1 or 2 week long activities, they may not make sense for students to get a paid account. Yeah, free accounts, yes, I tell them often, right? And very often Google with their Gmail integration, well, everybody has Gmail, and the Gemini category of tools have been pretty good. So that has been an easy way to get in, and now ChatGPT and Claude. Unless like Jeff, when you make it part of the course, yeah, then students probably have to buy the $20. I am trying to figure out as a college if we can provision cheap enough infrastructure at scale behind Illinois IDs, so that we can just have a faculty say, okay, I have $300 for this semester that I can allocate from my research budget, and that's probably good enough to handle a class of 50 for all the chat interactions that you need for 3 months. Yeah. There are ways out, and if you use AI to run through these, it makes it easier to make sure that the content you generate, the images you generate are labeled, follow accessibility standards. So that's the other kind of accessibility, right? You can automate that checks by using, in this case, I demonstrated the MCP tool. So I do all my accessibility checks through that tool itself, even though, Canvas has one.
Yeah, the cost, the cost of these is something I think we're going to have to keep talking about at an institutional level. One of the things I didn't have time to talk about is we built a new assessment tool for my new course that is, you can essentially think of it as an oral exam, but it's done via chat. And we had students do, and there's one of them that is linked off the website that you guys are welcome to play with. We had students do a few of those throughout the semester, including one in the computer-based testing facility. And I think this is kind of exciting because it essentially allows us to give these sort of automated assessments, but in a style that was never possible before, right? I mean, a lot of the times we have things that we want our students to know, and the process of creating an assessment is like figuring out how to get students to express those through like a multiple choice question or true false or something like that. Whereas with this model, it's like literally the student is just chatting with an agent, and the agent is responsible for figuring out what they know about something. When we did some cost, so we're working on a paper about this technique. When we looked at the cost, I think it was like a quarter per assessment, something like that, in terms of the amount of the AI that was used. And you can imagine like having a TA conduct that for an hour is more than a quarter. So yeah, I mean, I think we need to be measuring things and thinking carefully about this. But uh, in general, some of the things that we're talking about, as alternatives are human time, right, which is very, very valuable and is priced accordingly.
Thank you.
Colleen, I answered in the chat and it looks like you thumbed up it. But great question.
And one of the ways to find money for this, if you don't have your school supporting with discretionary funds or some additional grants, I mean, in Geese, we are lucky to have grants and stuff and all, is to actually just ask for these grants from these companies. So for the last year, all my OpenAI bills have been, and I wasn't using it too much, I was using Claude, were funded through an OpenAI research grant. They do it every 3 months, and they give you like $1,000 credits with a 1 page ask of what you're going to do. And then there are vendors that these days I'm a little wary of vendor lock-ins because the moment their finances start hurting, they change their plans on us. So I would say, figure out a way to leverage open source models more. Those are the cheapest and they are very good these days for classroom use.
Yeah, the only note of caution I would sound on this, though, is to sort of reiterate something that Jonathan said yesterday, which is, there are open models that are okay. I don't think that any of them are as capable as the frontier models yet. I think we'll get
Sure.
there.
Yeah.
And I think the danger of having students work with models that don't work well is that they draw incorrect conclusions about what AI is capable of. I think for me, it's like I mean, my time is pretty valuable, so I feel like that's an argument against using models that aren't the top of the line. But I think for students, like we are encountering some skepticism from students about what they can do with these tools, and I think we run the risk of reinforcing that if we have them use something that doesn't work very well. Patricia?
Jeff, you talked about the switch from giving students a grade for like the output to giving students a grade for effort. And this is really a source of a lot of debate and sometimes controversy and conflict within departments. Because you'll always have colleagues who will say, well, we're not, we're no longer upholding standards and so forth, because I'm imagining that if you do that, and I actually do a lot of assignments that are like that. I give the students a lot of work, right? A whole lot of work. And they actually have to do it. And that's how they get their grade. And somebody might, challenge me very easily on that and say, well, what kind of standards are you applying to what you're doing? So how do you manage that? And what do you think of that debate that people or that sort of binary people bring up? Is like, if you do that, if you give credit for effort, then you'll lower standards.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of probably what's happening is some of that debate predates, AI, right? It goes into things like alternative grading and things like that. And I think there are legitimate debates there. Um, my course, I mean, just to be clear, my course still does 70% of our assessment in the computer-based testing facility, and that is knowledge-based. So we still have a strong, anchor of that type of assessment. Um, I think, but I do think that if I was trying to grade other types of assignments, I think one of the things that's difficult right now, although it's kind of exciting at the same time, is that we don't know how to teach students how to use these tools. And I would argue we also don't necessarily even know what it looks like when students are using the tools well. Um, and so without, those things to guide us, what do we fall back on, right? I mean, I talked about this with my senior course staff. I said, well, how are we going to grade these projects, right? Because I can't grade the output because that's as much of a function of how ambitious the student was or whatever. Um, but, and so falling back on just having them do a certain amount of practice felt like something that made sense, right? Because at least I know that they spent those 20 hours working with the AI, prompting it, trying new things, trying to implement their design and stuff like that. And so I don't know. I mean, I feel like, if you couldn't, I'm trying to come up with an analogy here that works, but it's hard, right? It feels like if you just told me, well, I'm trying to get in better shape and I ran for 30 hours last month, I would think, well, that's pretty good, right? Like, I don't know how far you went, right? I don't know how fast you went. But just being able to do that much of that activity, like it is practice, right? And until we figure out like what represents better practice, what are some things that we want students to actually learn how to do, I think that's sort of what I would fall back on. Jennifer?
Yeah, just to respond to something that Geoffrey said, which I really appreciate, and I think is really important. Is in fact we don't know, how these tools affect learning, and I've been surprised in my own research when using ChatGPT to do writing didn't harm learning, but it was under certain particular circumstances, and I just think it's really important to not be saying like, oh, it works or it doesn't work, but it works for whom, on what kinds of tasks, on what kinds of content, in what kinds of learning contexts. I think that's really important to have some nuance, and I think all of you have actually done a fantastic job, right? None of you have said, ChatGPT, does this or doesn't do that to learning, but to always be thinking about, for whom, on what content, and with what kinds of tasks.
Yeah, thanks, Jennifer. I think that's a great point. I mean, I've written a little bit about it. I think we have, at least in the computing area, we have a tendency to view these tools as sort of magic. Um, and they're not magic, they're a skill, right? And I would also argue to your list, like I think there is skill that people are both learning and applying as they work with these tools, right? And so as educators, that puts us in a good position because there's still a lot to teach students, right? In terms of just how to use these well.
Well, I see we are at time. Any other questions before we sign off here? I appreciate you three being here this afternoon. Thank you so much for sharing. This was recorded, and we will make sure that the links are available for anyone who wants to review it. Last chance for questions. All right, Al, thank you so much.
Thank you.